Dear listeners, welcome to Faces of Digital Health, a podcast about digital health and how healthcare systems adopt technologies. I'm your host, Tjasa Zajc, and this episode is a reflection on the latest development around blockchain in healthcare. You will hear from Robert Miller, Director of Product Management and Strategy at Consensys Health. Consensys Health builds Ethereum-based solutions for cybersecurity, compliance, privacy, bioethics, and identity, applying the deep technical capabilities of Consensys to advance the healthcare industry. The blockchain community knows Robert because of his regular newsletter about blockchain in healthcare. He is diligently following and reflecting on the development of the industry. We discussed why are patient health records on blockchain currently still a dream, and which projects are in contrast slowly moving beyond the pilot phase. An interesting research initiative in healthcare is called MELLODY, which stands for Machine Learning Ledger Orchestration for Drug Discovery. MELLODY is a collaboration among 10 major pharma companies that are using blockchain-based infrastructure and federated learning to speed up drug development. Robert shared his view on MELLODY, and I also added the link to his written analysis in the show notes. We also talked about the potential use of blockchain for vaccination certification and more. Enjoy the show, and to read the recap or browse through other episodes as well, go to www.facesofdigitalhealth.com. And if you haven't yet, do subscribe to the show to be notified about new episodes automatically. And now, let's hear from Robert. Robert, the blockchain community knows you because of your newsletter about blockchain in healthcare. For a light start, tell me, how has the newsletter shaped you? How many years have you been writing it up by today? What have you learned? What fascinates you most?
It's a good question. I think I've been writing on some form of my newsletter for almost 3 years now. In the very earliest iteration, I think maybe only a dozen people were a part of this. But in the very earliest iteration of it, I had just made a sign-up form, and I would send people the blog posts that I wrote 3 years ago on Medium whenever I published them. And then this started 2 years ago now. I started to regularly blog about blockchain in healthcare every Sunday, really because I was already reading these things, and I find writing to be a really incredible tool for thinking through things, of learning, of really making clear arguments and thinking critically about the world. And one thing that my newsletter has taught me is just an appreciation for writing as a mode of thinking and of distilling your thoughts that I didn't appreciate otherwise. And over time, I mean, the genesis of me writing a newsletter was I was doing this work, and it was a way for me to work through it, a way to learn. And over time, as I developed theses and thoughts that you see reoccurring throughout my newsletter, sort of the substance of what I wanted to learn has changed, and I write fewer weekly newsletters of just like these events happened, and more long-form commentary now of analyzing trends, of really breaking down a subject, or writing something that I felt like nobody else was saying, or an observation of mine. And that really tracks like my process of learning. And the whole thing for me is about learning and sort of learning in public and seeing what other people react and getting smarter. So that's a brief overview.
So from that perspective and looking back for 3 years and for a warm up into this discussion, because blockchain from the technical perspective is a complicated thing to understand, how do you see that the development has changed or matured since you started writing these newsletters?
Well, 3 years ago, I think there was less of a clear idea on the things that blockchains were really good at. I don't think people really understand this still 3 years since then. But 3 years ago, there were all sorts of pie in the sky ideas on what blockchain was going to imminently change and how we were all going to be transacting in all of these different cryptocurrencies, and everything was going to be disrupted and yada yada yada. And you can argue like whether anybody ever really believed this or whether it was like a self-perpetuating machine of people trying to make money off of each other. But certainly the dominant narrative is that blockchains were good for many more things than they actually are. And I think we're much closer to the truth, although maybe not there yet on the sort of things that they are actually good for.
So what are blockchains not good about that you heard they were supposed to be good about?
I think anytime you only have a single party involved in some ecosystem, it's not a good fit for blockchain. Almost always. There may be a couple exceptions for that. It is really about multiple stakeholders needing some common platform to do things. And if you can solve a problem with a single party in some other infrastructure, that's probably the right thing to do, as opposed to using like this very slow distributed database that the developer tooling isn't very good. It costs a lot of computational power compared to other things, and etc. So you really need a problem where no single party can own the infrastructure, where the parties don't trust each other or may even be just straight up adversarial, and where there's a large trust deficit. This is like a necessary condition for a blockchain solution to work, but it's not sufficient. So even if that exists, you may still not have a good blockchain solution because it may be a good technical fit, but there may not be the right business incentives for a blockchain solution to take hold. So I think a lot of the times you'll see arguments about, well, it would be really great if we put this process on a blockchain. Pharma supply chains may be a good example. Mm-hmm. And, sure, it would be good. And you can see how if everybody aligned on something, that would be how it would add value. But the problem is not all the stakeholders in the pharmaceutical supply chain have the same incentives. And, maybe some of the benefits of blockchain, like transparency, aren't good in that context, because if there was full transparency, that means people who are selling you goods in a supply chain can see when you have low inventory, and as a result they can charge you more money when you have low inventory and price gouge, or vice versa. So full transparency is actually not a good thing, which is an example just to illustrate that even if a blockchain is a good technical solution, there may not be business incentives to adopt it, not even touching on governance as well, which is a whole different problem. So you need to have something with the right technical problem to solve, with the right business model across multiple stakeholders, and then where there's a governance model that makes sense as well. It's a pretty thin needle to thread.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a really, really good example to explain the issue of how the component that blockchain is usually described with, which is transparency, immutability, enabling privacy, how those don't always fit into each use case. I think it would be great if in the first wave of COVID we had PPE equipment on blockchain, so PPE supplies, because they were going missing. So it was interesting to see that in October, the Estonian Guard Time and SIGPA have announced a partnership with the World Health Organization to trace COVID-19 vaccines and provide tamper-proof vaccination certificates. So I guess what I'm wondering from this example is, how do you see the potential of the technology in the current pandemic? We talked about what blockchain is not good about, but where is the potential?
Well, I don't want it to be a downer in this episode too, because blockchains are good at many things. But I think this is an example of one thing that they probably are not very good at, tamper-proof vaccination certificates. I was thinking about this in the early days of the pandemic and how you might have like a zero knowledge proof posted to a public blockchain as a result to prove that someone has been vaccinated. And then, you can use that to go about your regular life or maybe travel across borders and whatnot. But the problem with this is there's no good way to tie a person and their identity to a private key and ensure that the person that is showing you a certificate or like a digital certificate is actually the real identity, the real person who that was issued for, right? No like tying of a real identity to a digital one in a strong enough way that I felt like it was a good solution. And without solving that problem, I don't know how you can provide vaccination certificates to really high degree of confidence. But I'm really excited about some of the work that's being done within the MELLODY consortium of Federated Learning and having multiple enterprises, large enterprises, collaborate together to train artificial intelligence algorithms to speed up drug development. I think that's super interesting, and it just pours gas on the fire that is already happening and speeding up biotech and development of new therapeutics and vaccines. And I'm also really excited about the work that's being done in the credentialing space of being able to use credentials and identities that were generated by one party in multiple different contexts and reduce administrative overhead. And then there's this other kind of design space of using a blockchain to adjudicate business contracts between different parties, where you otherwise would have this adjudication happening in silos. One party does some calculations on their infrastructure, maybe in a spreadsheet. Another party does it on their infrastructure, and then they need to compare answers. And usually the answers each party has is different. And so you see this problem space within pharmaceutical supply chains, in wholesaler chargebacks, as well as between, pretty much any stakeholder within the U.S. ecosystem, at least in value-based payments, of figuring out who owns who, how much money, depending on a patient's set of outcomes. So those are a couple different use cases that I'm excited about. I'm happy to dig into any of those if you want to talk about one or two specifically.
Definitely. I definitely want to talk about MELLODY a little bit more. But just before that, since you mentioned credentialing, which is tied to identity of an individual, so to which extent does that differ from having a blockchain-based certificate about vaccination?
The reason why I'm more excited about credentialing and not the health passports is that in the credentialing case, the hospital that someone is getting onboarded at will go to length to ensure that the person they're onboarding is really who they say they are. But in the immunity passport case, the business that wants to know someone who's trying to eat inside of a restaurant is really who they say they are, is going to scan a QR code, and they're not going to request your birth certificate or whatever. So there's just different levels of verifying someone's identity that I think makes the credentialing use case more viable. It's more about reducing administrative overhead than it is, ensuring that someone says who they are and ensuring that someone has really had a vaccine.
So if we move on to the MELLODY project, this is a collaboration among 10 major pharma companies that was announced in 2019. And the point was to use a blockchain-based infrastructure and with federated learning, enable training of algorithms without sharing your internal data. So basically 10 pharma companies said, okay, we can share our data in order to train algorithms, but other parties still won't know what our baseline information is. So that sounds very promising for speeding up drug development. And I think it would be awesome to see that also in vaccine development, which is happening with a warp speed, leaving aside that that's the name of the initiative in the US. So did you see that any project like this, like MELLODY, was also used for vaccine development? You are following the MELLODY projects more closely.
Yeah, I am. I don't think that it was used for vaccine development. I mean, MELLODY is really a research and development project with an eye towards becoming production ready in its later stages. So the very first year of MELLODY was entirely dedicated to basically defining and honing the security model and then running a series of audits. So I wrote about this in a blog post that I have. I'll send you. You can put it in the links to the show. But in a federated learning network, right, all these parties are training algorithms on their data without ever showing their data. But the sort of problem with this is when you are trying to fit an algorithm to a data to make a prediction with it, that algorithm sort of embeds information in it by trying to fit itself so closely to some information. You can leave traces of your underlying data in it. And this is obviously a bad thing if you're training your data on sensitive information that you want to keep private. So there's a trade-off that you have between privacy and accuracy. And you want, as an enterprise, if you want to collaborate with your competitors on a federated learning algorithm, you want some level of privacy as a minimum guarantee, which means you need to make a sacrifice of accuracy. And the first year of the MELLODY project was trying to ensure that there's a minimum level of privacy that could be guaranteed to all the participants before they actually use their sensitive information on it. And this is a pretty remarkably difficult technical challenge today. And then you need third parties that are independent to audit and ensure that you're actually meeting that minimum level of privacy. And the MELLODY project was able to do that, but it did take them a whole year. And then the next 2 years of the project now are going from this minimum level of privacy that they have and trying to maximize the accuracy of the algorithm that is being trained without sacrificing any level of privacy. But back in March, the MELLODY project had not yet gone through all these audits and independent certifications that they could meet the minimum level of privacy that these enterprises need to turn the software on in their sensitive information. So maybe if the pandemic had happened, 8 months later, MELLODY could have been used to speed up vaccine development. But unfortunately, it wasn't in the place to be used at that time, I think. But the next pandemic, whenever it happens, hopefully a long time from now, we'll have these systems in place.
Yeah. Well, I still hope that the next pandemic does not come too soon. We mentioned that MELLODY is a research project. So what about other blockchain projects that perhaps are already used in practice. Are there any? Is the technology ripe enough to be used in practice?
Yeah, I think it is getting there. I mean, if you really want to do something with blockchain technology, you could today. But like some of the developer tooling still isn't where I would like it to be. Some of the understanding of it isn't where you want to be. So there's certainly things that might be barriers, but the technology is ready to be used. There's no longer challenges around scaling. You can get around those if you'd like. There are tools for privacy as well. So these kind of barriers that held people back in maybe 2017, 2018, I don't think are really applicable, at least insofar as it relates to scaling and privacy and maybe some enterprise integration stuff as well. As far as things that are live and going beyond pilot, I would point you to ProCredX, which is doing provider credentialing, allowing different providers within the US to consume the credentials that other providers have generated, which allows them to onboard new healthcare professionals way quicker. It takes a couple months to do it normally, and they can cut that down to a few days, because much of what is being done in the process of onboarding a healthcare professional is repeated multiple different times. Then you can use a blockchain to record like instances of the documents that need to be procured, which are the same across different onboarding procedures, hash them to a blockchain, and allow other parties to consume these at a fee, which will allow them to onboard new healthcare professionals way quicker, ultimately revenue generating. It's a win-win-win for everybody involved. Some other things that are live and have gone beyond pilot right now are MetaLedger and their VRS solution, which is helping companies to comply with the first requirement of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act within the US, which has to do with the traceability of medicines. And I think there are a couple value-based payments systems that are live within the US that are helping parties to speed up the adjudication of value-based payments where outcomes and where payments are tied to outcomes, and you need some shared understanding of what outcomes were in order to pay out payments to the appropriate party.
What about in the area of patient records? In 2018, when ICOs were a popular way of fundraising, over 100 teams tried to compete, or not compete, just tried to raise money with ICOs to create a blockchain patient record where patients would potentially even be rewarded if they opened up their records for research or for pharma. How do you see companies manage patient data with blockchain? And is there already an understanding and preparedness of healthcare institutions to install such an infrastructure? Or are we just not there yet at all, since, the interoperability issues are very much present still?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. There are a lot of people that were chasing this dream, including me at some points in my career, I should say. But the problems that exist with the blockchain patient record space, I don't think are necessarily technical. There are some things that you would like a better way of storing files in a decentralized way, for example, and that's like a technical challenge that hasn't yet become overcome. But if you were willing to make some compromises on those parts of the system, then the remaining problems really have to do with business incentives and governance and like social challenges, one of them being interoperability, like you said. And I find it very hard to see a traditional healthcare enterprise throwing away their $1 billion Epic or Cerner implementation and deciding to install some blockchain EHR or something like that, right? Maybe what the path forward instead could be is with the ONCs, a regulatory body in the US, their information blocking regulations coming into force. There will be standardized APIs that are easy for patients to request their data from. And this could be a way for patients to at least populate their health record with their information in a much more easy way than historically they've had. But then, you would just have your information on your smartphone. Maybe it's controlled by a blockchain there. You don't have all the other parties in the network that you would need to really make it work and make it make sense. So this problem of creating a network and getting multiple parties on this network is really the thorny one that I haven't seen anybody been able to solve at least to this stage.
So it's still more like a dream.
Still a dream. But it's like what the whole blockchain and healthcare space likes to talk about and still work towards. After like a couple of years in this space, it's all anybody talks about at a conference. And, I'm taking small steps to it over time as well, but it is a dream today and will remain like that for some time.
Do you see that the whole blockchain space made a lot of progress in the last few years? Because my impression is that after the focus moved away from ICOs, that somehow, I'm going to say this metaphorically, but kind of the blockchain development just had time to develop itself without all the limelight put on it, and the hype of the potential that's there or has been misinterpreted of being there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was pretty weird actually how this space developed, because in the end of 2017 was when the crypto bubble popped. And that was when like a lot of the mainstream folks that didn't really know anything about crypto left. No offense to them, of course, but and you just had left in the crypto space a bunch of builders who were really value aligned and understood the technology and weren't in it necessarily for the money. But it took quite some time for that pop to be felt within the blockchain and healthcare space. It's kind of odd. I've never really been able to make sense of that. So the sort of hype kept on going for a couple of months, well into 2018, maybe a little bit into 2019 as well. And then it quieted down, and you stopped seeing like ICOs and some of the more crazy ideas that had been flung around. And there was a more muted time of building where folks could build things without the limelight. They could come to a shared understanding of what these technologies are actually good at and what they're not, before it seems like we're about to gear up for another run in the limelight, maybe in a couple months. Mm-hmm. So I would agree. I think it was overall good for the space too.
What would you say to those that say that blockchain is okay and has some positive sides, but existing technologies can already solve a lot of issues related to privacy and data security, which are among the top qualities mentioned when talking about what's positive about blockchain solutions?
I don't necessarily disagree with that statement, although it is complicated, and I think like some of the promise of blockchain technology has yet to be realized, and it may not be realized for some time. There's sort of this idea of a decentralized web. Web3 is what it's called, where everybody will own their data, and folks will get paid to contribute it to services. It'll be more private. All of these things, user-driven, community-owned, all these great things. And a lot of the infrastructure for that is possible. And in the last 3 years, since the last time in the limelight, to use your words, there's been like a lot of building towards it. but we're not there yet. You can sort of see the puzzle pieces now and how they might fit together, and they're real now. I don't think they were really substantial in 2017, but yeah, they don't exist today. So I think today, for the most part, that statement is true, although you can see how in the future, with a little bit more time, resources, and investment, some of the more like Web3, decentralized web, everybody has their own data, it's all private, etc., kind of vision could come to life. Yeah.
How fast do you think that could be? Are we talking 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time?
I don't know. It's a good question. If you made me predict, I'd say 2 to 5 years before there is like a real internet scale community that looks like what everybody seems to think blockchains will really bring to the internet, of user-owned communities, of private data, of more secure data, and this and that.
That's an optimistic outlook then.
Yeah, I suppose so. I'm pretty close to the technology that's being built, so it's an optimistic time. I feel better about the space today than I did, a year ago, and certainly 2.
You've been writing a lot about open governance network and neutral platforms. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are open governance networks and why are they interesting for healthcare?
Well, so there's this idea of neutral platforms. It was first articulated by Chris Dixon of A16Z fame in his seminal essay called Why Decentralization Matters. And it looked at this life cycle that exists within platforms, where when platforms are starting out, they do everything they can to recruit users and third-party complements like developers or businesses, media organizations, to get on their platform, start using it. And as more users and more third parties like developers or businesses are on the platform, it becomes way more valuable. And there's like this exponential effect of how fast the network is growing and how valuable it is. But at some point, you get enough users and third parties on the platform whereby the incremental extra user isn't that much more valuable. And at this point, it may be more advantageous to a platform to start trying to extract value from its users, as opposed to trying to bring new users onto the platform, or to the platform may compete with the creators and the businesses, the developers on its platform, instead of trying to enable them. As an example, Facebook kicked its competitor Zynga off the platform. Twitter shut third-party clients off. And in healthcare, 23andMe shut out third-party analytics services off of natively integrating into its API. And these things are ultimately value destroying in most cases for users who would benefit from multiple different parties building on this ecosystem. But since historically platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been centralized, there's no real way to stop this from happening. You need new types of infrastructure, like what we've been talking about in blockchains and this Web3 dream of user-owned, distributed, decentralized platforms and whatnot. And if you used a blockchain to underlie these new generation of platforms, then they would be neutral to all users and businesses on top of them. So the platform couldn't turn around at some point and start to compete with the businesses that are building on it. And that would foster a lot more innovation. It would allow entrepreneurs to feel safe in building on certain infrastructure. And it wouldn't allow businesses to keep others out of the ecosystem at the loss of users. So one place that you can see this today is within Epic. That is a platform. It has really strong network effects. It's been adopted in a number of different places, but they are pretty closed in that they don't allow others to build applications on top of their software. And maybe they allow you to write some things that will read data by using their app store, but they won't let you actually change any of the internal workflows or to write data back or integrate in a deeper way. And one concrete way that this has shown up is that Epic bought a telemedicine company. And this immediately makes you wonder whether now that Epic has a telehealth app, they're doing telemedicine in the telemedicine business, are they going to change their platform in some way to disadvantage other companies like Amwell, for example, or ZocDoc or other telemedicine providers so that they aren't able to access the health data within an EHR, an Epic EHR, or integrate in some deeper way? And everybody, has to use Epic de facto because no other parties can integrate into Epic. Or to use your health passport app. Maybe Epic launches their own health passport and they don't allow anyone else to create a health passport that integrates into an Epic EHR. So there are all sorts of examples of these places in healthcare where you can see how an existing incumbent has misaligned incentives and a closed ecosystem where it would be really great if we had open and neutral infrastructure that would allow multiple different parties to build on a level playing field, and that would foster more innovation and better services. I think consumers would ultimately be better served. Certainly entrepreneurs and developers would be, and the actual companies that deliver healthcare would be as well. I think some of these problems are the reason why the right information doesn't get to the right parties at the right time, and patients end up suffering because of that. And to loop this back, this is a long answer, but I'll let you follow up in just a second. To loop this back to open governance networks, which is what you were referring to, open governance networks are this new type of Linux Foundation project that they recently launched, where the Linux Foundation, as a neutral third party that sees over and facilitates a lot of critical open source software, is going to be acting as a facilitator and a hoster of critical open source code within blockchain networks. And they hope to build communities around these in specific industries like healthcare. I think they've got one in telecoms, to try and build the kind of platforms that I'm talking about in a decentralized way, hosted by a neutral party that isn't subject to the commercial interests of any individual enterprise. So this is sort of their answer to the same problems that I was just talking about, and a neutral platform is one way to look at it. So that was a long answer, and I'll give you a chance to react or follow up.
Yeah, so my follow-up is that it sounds like a great idea, something that healthcare could definitely use. The question is it viable? Is it possible without regulation or legislative action to enforce this? Because, you mentioned yourself, Epic, for example, has a lot of power. So if you've got power players that solutions like this would be hurtful to, how can you drive progress forward?
Well, I think I generally think that a lot of that there could be second order effects that folks do not think of from regulatory actions, and some of the discourse around antitrust in the U.S. right now, I think stems from hindsight bias of looking back at an action that was taken under a great deal of uncertainty and judging a decision by its outcomes as opposed to the actual setting at the time. So I don't think that like breaking up Epic is going to be for example, to relate it back to the antitrust discourse within the US, I don't think breaking up Epic is going to be the right thing to do. But I do think that opening up Epic or opening up Facebook or Amazon or these companies is the right approach of having them create open, standardized APIs that under the right situations with the right safeguards for consumers and patients, letting other applications be able to interoperate and use these APIs within their services. So taking your social graph on Twitter, for example, and being able to use it within another service. I think this would be, or your shopping information from Amazon, or your social graph from Facebook, or your data from Epic, for example. So this is the approach that I would take of opening up these parties rather than breaking them up. And to large point, I think this does map well with what the ONC has done in their information blocking regulations, which give an actual like stick along with the carrot that has existed thus far to interoperability. So if healthcare enterprises are not providing easy APIs that are standardized for consumers to access their data and mediate it where they wish, then the ONC can actually impose penalties on healthcare enterprises now, as opposed to before, where there was really just incentives to interoperate instead of real fees. So I do think that does achieve this opening up that I'm talking about, and this is my preferred measure. There may be other ways to kind of facilitate these neutral platforms, but I need to think about that a little bit more.
Speaking about opening up, do you still see that there's a discussion happening whether a public or a private blockchain makes more sense? So perhaps what are the challenges that you see in practical adoption of blockchain up to date? Is this still the question that's visible or discussed often?
Yeah, so it's still talked about a little bit. It's not as much as I actually think it should be. I am of the opinion that public blockchains will ultimately be more important than private ones, which is like not a very popular opinion within my space. Most people think the opposite, because in the healthcare industry, like a lot of information is sensitive, right? So you don't want to put that on a public blockchain, and then enterprises generally just don't like interacting with public blockchains. Maybe because of their reputation or something like this. But those arguments don't really resonate with me, because even on a private blockchain, you're not going to post sensitive data. Like no sensible party is going to put a patient's health record on a private blockchain. And you're going to store it off chain somewhere, and then maybe post a hash at most onto a private blockchain. So if you're doing this, then why not just post that hash onto a public blockchain? It's not the actual health data itself. By using a public blockchain, you get more guarantees of integrity. You don't need to host nodes and deal with like all of the headaches. It costs a lot of money actually to keep up a node, and you're probably going to be paying a service provider to help you do that and monitor it. And the transaction fees are not that bad comparative to hosting your own nodes. So, and moreover, there's all sorts of other stuff that you can do on a public blockchain and interoperate with. There's a whole ecosystem there. So I really lean towards towards public blockchains as opposed to private ones. But this is not not the consensus opinion within my space. And I think the challenges have to do with a difficulty in interacting with them. Like I've been talking about a little bit. There's not very good developer tooling in the blockchain space, and particularly for the kind of systems that enterprises are used to working with. It's just not that easy to interact with either a public or a private blockchain. And I don't think there is as good of an understanding as there could be on the benefits of public blockchains versus private ones. I think early on in the discourse of when maybe 2016, 2017, there was a rush by the innovators at the time just to sort of dismiss away public blockchains and try to put private blockchains in a totally different category than public, because public blockchains are associated with cryptocurrencies, and like nobody wanted to be the guy in an enterprise that was talking about cryptocurrency for whatever reason. And because of this, this original discarding of public blockchains, I don't think people have built up the kind of institutional knowledge or maybe ways of thinking about public blockchains and their benefits. And I see them as generally underused to date.
Your newsletter is your own personal project, but for work you are a part of Consensys Health as the Director of Product Management and Strategy. Can you tell me a little bit more about the project solutions built by Consensys Health?
Yeah, Consensys Health is building specifically things that use the Ethereum blockchain. We think that the Ethereum blockchain is the best place to be building for the community, for its unique ability to tether to the Ethereum mainnet if needed, for all of the tooling that exists, for its security, all these different things. And we use it in a couple different contexts, but I focus on our enterprise federated learning product. So we've been talking about federated learning earlier in the conversation, and we are building a stack of technologies that is specific to healthcare enterprises that want to use federated learning on their data, whether that is a pharma company on its preclinical data or maybe something in the supply chain, or if you are a healthcare enterprise that has patient data and is interested in collaborating with other healthcare enterprises. We're building the technology for that meets all the cybersecurity, compliance, privacy, bioethics requirements that an organization would need.
That sounds very interesting. I actually never thought about federated learning perhaps being an enhancer of interest in blockchain, but when you have an idea that you could accelerate your research through it by developing your own algorithms with the help of other institutions' data, that's kind of something that I think sounds much more compelling for perhaps those that are at the moment still skeptical about blockchain.
Well, and federated learning has a big problem in most of its deployments. So in a traditional federated learning network, you have a single party that is deciding what algorithm is deployed on the devices or the computers within the network. So Google and their autocorrect prediction network is the most popular and most well-known example of whenever you're typing, your smartphone will give you predictions on what you're typing next or maybe correct what you're saying. And it is one party, Google, that decides what algorithm is trained and how it's used within the network. But in the context of enterprises and sensitive health information, this is totally not tenable because giving one party, probably your competitor, the ability to choose what is run on your infrastructure is problematic. They may deploy an algorithm that purposely trains really closely to your data, and as a result, your data is essentially embedded within the algorithm. That's something that is possible to do, and your data ends up being revealed to the other parties. But the solution to this is using a blockchain to decentralize control over what is trained on the network and to equip participants with data access management tools for them to be able to say, only this data set or this data set are available for training, and all these other data sets are off limits. And then to record the actions of a federated learning network on a ledger so that there is an audit trail where participants are then sure that their policies are respected and that their data actually hasn't been revealed. And then lastly, there's some more forward-looking and really interesting work that we've been doing on layering on incentives to these networks too, of getting a group of enterprises together to collaborate on an algorithm, and the resulting algorithm maybe allocating percentage ownage of that algorithm to different parties depending on how valuable their data contributions were. And it's difficult to do this, but theoretically it is possible with the right mechanism for allocating contributions and compensating parties appropriately, which would really incentivize more collaboration and more participation in these networks and help them to scale. So those are the places where we see blockchains fitting into federated learning networks, and how I think they really enable them to truly work in a collaborative way and scale in a way that's not possible in traditional federated learning networks.
I just have one more question for you, and that is, what's your prediction about blockchain in the upcoming 3 to 5 years? We've talked a little bit about it before, but if you put it like that, what would your answer be?
I think, well, one thing that I can say that's concrete is I think crypto is going to go from being a joke to being very important in people's lives really quickly. That's like on the public blockchain side. And then on the private blockchain side, the more like enterprise focused thing, I think a lot of the ideas that people had in 2017, 2018 are going to start to become viable and true with new types of infrastructure that we have after like years and years of building and investment. But I don't think these things are going to end up being realized in the way that most people initially think they will. Like these new types of tools that use new infrastructures, oftentimes their first killer use cases will start out looking like jokes or like games. And then over time, they become something really of their own and fully fledged, and their true potential and maybe application to other places are really realized. So that's like a roundabout way of saying, I think many of the things that folks thought would happen earlier in 2017 will happen, but maybe just not in the way that we expect. Very vague prediction. But there are a lot of the things in place for that to happen. And then I'm very excited about federated learning, obviously, and its potentials for more collaborative algorithms and really scaling things to many different parties. And I think we'll see federated learning algorithms be embedded into more consumer-facing health applications. And this may in some ways like realize some of the promises of blockchain. For example, I have an Oura ring, which gives me metrics on my sleep and my heart rate today. And this is done within a silo. I know my heart rate and my metrics and whatever, and that's analyzed within a silo. But I have no easy way of scaling this up to a community around me. You have quantified self, but not the quantified community around me. And I think you could you could see how by layering on federated learning or other similar technologies, you could quickly build something that was new and valuable, of doing collective community-based analytics on top of health information that is valuable to a community, going from quantified self to quantified community. And I fully expect that to happen within the next 2 to 5 years, if not sooner.
That almost sounds futuristic, but if I remember correctly, you're quite not a fan, but very interested in biohacking.
Very, yeah. I think the future will look very different than what people think it looks, than what today looks like. I mean, it's almost ontological, right? It's the future, so it has to be different. But I'm willing to entertain these kind of ideas, and I am also very interested in biohacking. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of potential there.
The future is gonna look different. That almost sounds like you know something that we don't. So do share how the future will look like.
Well, I mean, any of this stuff is something that you and I know. Maybe there are other things that I know that you don't, that are just not distributed to the rest of the world, right? There's, I think it's a Gibson quote of "the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." So these technological trends that we know today are like secrets that everybody else is not in on. And that's why we do a podcast on them, right? To help the rest of the world get in on the secret.
You've been listening to Faces of Digital Health. If you enjoyed the show, leave a rating or a review by going to www.lovethepodcast.com/Faces of Digital Health, and you will be redirected to the platform appropriate for your device. Stay tuned!